Once upon a time, there was a small town nestled in the mountains. The townspeople were friendly and welcoming, but they had a deep, dark secret that they kept hidden from outsiders. Every year, on the night of the full moon, a creature would come down from the mountains and terrorize the town. The townspeople called it the moon beast, and they would lock themselves in their homes, praying that it wouldn't find them. One year, a group of outsiders arrived in town on the night of the full moon. They had been traveling through the mountains and had no idea about the moon beast. They thought the townspeople were just being paranoid and decided to stay out in the open, enjoying the beauty of the night. But as the moon rose higher in the sky, they heard a blood-curdling scream. It sounded like it was coming from the town square. The group cautiously made their way towards the noise, and what they saw chilled them to the bone. In the center of the town square stood a massive creature with glowing eyes, sharp claws, and teeth as long as their fingers. It was the moon beast, and it was attacking the townspeople. The outsiders were frozen in fear, unable to move as the moon beast turned its gaze towards them. They knew they had to run, but it was too late. The creature lunged towards them, and they scattered in different directions. The moon beast chased them through the town, its hot breath on their heels. They tried to hide, but it seemed to always find them. It was like it could smell their fear. As dawn approached, the moon beast suddenly stopped its pursuit and retreated back into the mountains. The outsiders were left shaken and traumatized by the experience, but they knew they had to leave the town as soon as possible. Years went by, and the group of outsiders went their separate ways. But every full moon, they would have nightmares about the moon beast, reliving the terror they felt that night in this small town. They never forgot the fear that had consumed them, and they wondered if the moon beast still roamed the mountains, waiting for its next victim. Caroline had always been fascinated by the paranormal. As a child, she would sneak out of bed at night to read ghost stories by the light of the moon. As she grew older, she became more daring in her pursuits, visiting abandoned buildings and cemeteries in search of supernatural experiences. One night, Caroline and her friends decided to investigate an old, abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. They had heard rumors of strange noises and apparitions, and they were eager to see if the stories were true. As they made their way through the dark corridors of the asylum, Caroline's heart raced with excitement. The building was eerie and foreboding, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as they descended deeper into the bowels of the building. Suddenly, Caroline heard a noise. It was a soft, whispering sound, barely audible over the creaking of the floorboards. She turned to her friends, but they were already several feet ahead of her, oblivious to the danger that lurked in the shadows. Caroline felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, following her every move. She tried to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger as they continued through the asylum. As they reached the basement, Caroline's fear turned to terror. The air was thick with the smell of decay and rot, and she could feel something brushing against her ankles. She looked down and saw the flicker of a shadow, moving quickly through the darkness. Panicking, Caroline turned to run, but she felt something grab hold of her ankle. She screamed, struggling to free herself from the unseen grasp, but it was too strong. She was pulled down, dragged into the darkness by the malevolent force that haunted the abandoned asylum. Her friends never saw her again. They searched the asylum, but all they found was a single shoe, lying abandoned in the basement. Caroline had been taken by the spirits that dwelled in the darkness, never to be seen or heard from again. Lena had always been fascinated by the paranormal. She loved reading ghost stories and watching horror movies, but she never expected to encounter something truly terrifying in real life. One night, While walking home from her friend's house, Lena felt like she was being followed. She turned around and saw a shadowy figure in the distance, watching her. It was too dark to make out any features, but Lena could feel its gaze fixed on her. She tried to shake off the feeling and quickened her pace, but the figure kept pace with her, always just out of sight. Lena started to feel panicked and decided to cut through a nearby park to get home faster. As she made her way through the park, Lena heard footsteps behind her. She turned around and saw the shadowy figure again, now only a few feet away. She froze in fear, unable to move as the figure slowly approached her. Suddenly, a bright light flashed on, revealing the figure to be a man in a black hoodie. He smiled at her menacingly and pulled out a knife. Lena tried to run, but he was too fast. He caught up to her and plunged the knife into her back. Lena fell to the ground, gasping for air as the man walked away, disappearing into the shadows. As Lena lay dying, she realized that sometimes, the things we fear most are very real. She wished she had never taken that shortcut through the park, and she wished she had never encountered the shadowy figure. But it was too late. Her life was slipping away, and all she could do was pray that she would somehow find peace in the afterlife. As soon as Sarah stepped inside the abandoned house, she knew something was wrong. The air was thick and musty, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Despite the sense of unease that washed over her, she pressed on, determined to explore every inch of the place. As she climbed the stairs to the second floor, she heard a faint whisper. She couldn't make out what it was saying, but it was enough to send chills down her spine. She continued on, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the top of the stairs, she saw something move out of the corner of her eye. She turned to look, but there was nothing there. She shrugged it off and continued down the hallway. That's when she heard it, a low growl coming from behind one of the doors. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of her. She pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The room was completely dark, but she could feel something breathing on the back of her neck. She tried to turn around, but she was paralyzed with fear. The breathing grew louder and more intense, until it was almost suffocating. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, and Sarah saw the source of the breathing. It was a ghostly figure, hovering in the air right in front of her. Its eyes were empty sockets, and its face twisted into a grotesque sneer. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. The ghostly figure lunged at her, and everything went black. When Sarah woke up, she was lying on the floor in the hallway. She scrambled to her feet and ran down the stairs, desperate to get out of the house. As she reached the front door, she felt something cold and clammy grab her ankle. She screamed and kicked at it, but it wouldn't let go. Just when she thought she was going to be dragged back into the house, the hand released her. She stumbled outside, gasping for air. As she looked back at the house, she saw the ghostly figure standing in the doorway, watching her with its empty eyes. Sarah knew she would never be the same after that experience. She never spoke of it to anyone, but she could still feel the ghostly presence lurking in the back of her mind, haunting her every waking moment. John woke up disoriented and in complete darkness. He tried to move his arms and legs but found himself tied to a cold metal chair. Panic set in as he realized he couldn't remember how he ended up here or where he was. The last thing he remembered was leaving the bar late at night, and now he was here, in this dark and eerie place. He yelled for help, but no one answered. The air was thick and musty, and the only sound he heard was the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. He tried to remember how he got here, but his mind was blank. Days went by, and John was still in the same place. He tried to conserve his energy and ration the little food and water he was given. He tried to break free from the ropes that tied him to the chair, but they were too tight. As the days went on, John began to lose track of time. His only companions were the rats that scurried around in the darkness, and the unbearable stench that filled the air. He prayed for a way out and hoped that someone would come to his rescue. One day, the door to the cellar opened, and a figure emerged from the darkness. John couldn't make out who it was, but he knew it wasn't someone who was going to help him. The figure approached him, holding a rusty knife in its hand. John tried to plead for his life, but the figure didn't seem to care. It slowly walked towards him, the knife glinting in the dim light. John closed his eyes, ready for the worst, but the figure just cut the ropes that bound him to the chair and left. John was free, but he was alone in the dark cellar, without any idea of how to get out. He stumbled around, searching for a way out, but all he found was a small crack in the wall. He crawled through it, desperate to escape. When he finally emerged, he found himself in a deserted area, miles away from civilization. It was clear that he was left to die in the middle of nowhere. John knew he was lucky to be alive, but the trauma of his ordeal stayed with him for the rest of his life. It was the middle of the night, and Emily was driving home from a late shift at work. As she drove down the dark, winding road, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every time she looked in her rearview mirror, she saw nothing but darkness. But still, she felt a presence behind her, as if someone or something was lurking just out of sight. Suddenly, Emily's headlights illuminated a figure in the road ahead of her. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered gown, with long, tangled hair that hung in her face. Emily slowed her car to a stop and rolled down her window. "Do you need help?" she asked. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she simply stood there, staring at Emily with empty eyes. Feeling uneasy, Emily began to back her car up. But as she did, she heard a thud, as if something had landed on the roof of her car. Emily looked up and saw the woman's face pressed against her window, her mouth open in a silent scream. Emily screamed and hit the gas, speeding away from the woman as fast as she could. But even as she drove away, Emily could hear the woman's eerie laughter echoing in her ears, and she knew that she would never be able to forget that terrifying encounter. The night was dark and still, and the only sound that could be heard was the faint rustling of leaves as a figure moved through the forest. It was Jane, a young woman who had lost her beloved cat, Whiskers, earlier that day. She had searched everywhere in her neighborhood but had no luck finding him. Desperate to find her furry friend, Jane decided to venture into the woods, hoping that Whiskers had wandered off and was somewhere in there. As she walked deeper into the woods, Jane realized that she had forgotten to bring a flashlight. She cursed herself for the oversight but kept moving forward, using the moonlight to guide her way. It wasn't long before she heard a faint meowing in the distance. Jane's heart leapt with joy as she followed the sound, convinced that it was Whiskers. The meowing grew louder as she drew closer to the source. Eventually, Jane found herself standing in front of a large, abandoned house that looked like it had been lived in for years. The sound was coming from inside, and she immediately thought of Whiskers being trapped inside. Without hesitation, Jane pushed open the creaky front door and stepped inside. The air was musty and stale, and the only light came from the moonbeams shining through the dirty windows. As she walked through the house, following the sound of Whiskers meowing, Jane couldn't shake off the feeling that she was being watched. Suddenly, the meowing stopped, and Jane froze in her tracks. She listened intently, but there was no sound coming from the house anymore. Then, She heard a low growling sound coming from somewhere behind her. She slowly turned around, and her blood ran cold as she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. Jane stumbled backward and fell to the ground, her heart racing with fear. She scrambled to her feet and ran towards the front door, but it was blocked by an unseen force. Panic set in as she realized that she was trapped in the house with whatever was watching her. The growling grew louder and closer, and Jane could feel hot breath on the back of her neck. She screamed for help, but no one could hear her cries in the depths of the woods. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her own screams as she was dragged deeper into the darkness, never to be seen again. Some say that if you venture into the woods at night, you can still hear the faint sound of whiskers meowing and the low growling of the creature that took Jane. So, be warned, and never go searching for your lost pets alone in the woods at night. Once upon a time, there was a man named Jack who moved into a new apartment. It was an old building, but it was all he could afford. He didn't mind the creaky floors or the occasional draft, but there was one thing that he couldn't ignore. Every night when he would lay down to sleep, he would hear the sound of an old lady's voice calling out his name. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but the voice grew louder and more persistent with each passing night. It sounded like it was coming from the other side of his bedroom door, but when he would open it, no one would be there. He tried to brush it off and tell himself it was just the wind or the building settling, but the voice became more and more distinct. It was always the same phrase, "Jack, come see me. Jack, come see me." One night, unable to take it anymore, he decided to investigate. He followed the sound of the voice, which led him down the hallway and into the stairwell. He cautiously descended the stairs, still hearing the voice calling out his name. Finally, he reached the basement level, where the voice seemed to be coming from. As he cautiously made his way through the dark and dusty basement, the voice grew louder and more urgent. Then, he saw her, an old lady with wild hair and piercing eyes, sitting in the corner of the basement, beckoning him closer with an gnarled finger. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he slowly approached her. "Jack, come see me," she whispered, her voice low and raspy. "I've been waiting for you." Suddenly, the lights flickered on, and he saw that the old lady was holding a pair of scissors in her hand. He stumbled backward, trying to get away from her, but she lunged at him with the scissors, cackling maniacally. Jack managed to escape, but he never forgot the terrifying voice that haunted him every night. He moved out of the apartment soon after and never looked back. But even to this day, he sometimes hears the sound of the old lady's voice calling out his name, a constant reminder of the horror he endured in that old building. Maggie had always been fascinated with the paranormal. She would often spend her free time researching and reading about ghost stories and haunted places. One day, she stumbled upon an old abandoned mansion in the outskirts of town that was said to be haunted by the ghost of a wealthy couple who had died in a tragic accident. Maggie couldn't resist the temptation to explore the mansion, so she gathered a few of her friends and they decided to spend the night there. As they entered the mansion, they were immediately greeted by the musty smell of old furniture and decaying wood. They started exploring the mansion, and as they were walking down the dark hallways, they suddenly heard a sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. They froze in fear as the footsteps grew louder and closer, until they were right above them. Suddenly, they heard the sound of a woman's voice whispering, "Get out! Get out!" over and over again. Maggie and her friends were paralyzed with fear and didn't know what to do. Then, they saw a figure appear at the top of the stairs. It was the ghostly apparition of the woman they had read about, and she was beckoning them to come closer. They tried to run, but they were trapped as the doors had mysteriously locked themselves. As they stood there, helpless and scared, the ghostly couple appeared before them. They were transparent and their eyes glowed an eerie red. Maggie and her friends screamed in terror as the ghosts closed in on them, and they knew they were doomed. The next day, the mansion was found abandoned once again. Nobody knows what happened to Maggie and her friends, but some say that the ghosts of the wealthy couple still haunt the mansion to this day, waiting for their next victims to come along. Sarah loved collecting antique dolls. The house was filled with them, all arranged neatly on shelves and in display cases. She spent hours poring over auction listings and scouring flea markets for the perfect additions to her collection. One day, Sarah stumbled upon a doll that caught her eye. It was a beautiful porcelain doll with long, curly hair and a frilly dress. The doll's eyes seemed to follow Sarah wherever she went, and she couldn't resist buying it. As soon as Sarah brought the doll home, strange things began to happen. She would wake up in the middle of the night to find the doll had moved from its shelf to her bedside table. She would hear tiny footsteps and giggling coming from the doll's room, even though she knew no one else was in the house. Sarah began to feel uneasy around the doll. Its eyes seemed to bore into her soul, and she felt like it was watching her every move. She tried to ignore the strange occurrences and tell herself that it was just her imagination. But things only got worse. One night, Sarah woke up to find the doll sitting on her chest, its porcelain face inches from hers. She tried to scream, but she couldn't move. The doll's eyes glowed red in the darkness, and Sarah felt like it was sucking the air out of her lungs. After that night, Sarah knew she had to get rid of the doll. She tried to sell it, but no one would take it. She tried to throw it away, but it always ended up back in her house. Sarah became increasingly desperate to get rid of the doll and the sinister presence it brought with it. One day, Sarah finally found a buyer for the doll. She packed it up and sent it off, relieved to be rid of it at last. But that night, she heard a scratching at her bedroom window. When she looked outside, she saw the doll staring back at her, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. Sarah knew then that the doll would never leave her alone. It was cursed, and she was doomed to be haunted by it for the rest of her life. From that day on, Sarah lived in fear of the haunted doll, always looking over her shoulder and waiting for its next attack. She knew she could never escape its clutches, and that it would always be there, waiting to torment her.